All right, so we're going to roll into now our workshop on staffing formulas and non-personnel allocations. So I'll turn it back over to the superintendent.
Thank you, Board Chair Lentz. Just a quick process question for you and Superintendent Townsend. Is there any chance we could swap those? I wasn't expecting that we'd be so speedy, so I have 3 people joining us. I'm furiously texting them, get on the call. Is that possible?
It's totally possible.
It's not typical that we'd go so fast, so I had told people they could put children to bed.
I know. I feel a little bit like I have whiplash.
Yeah.
We can totally change. Let me just get my the correct screen up. So we're gonna.
That works. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Totally. No, that's an easy fix for sure. So board members, what the next section is going to be about is just really thinking about our salary range for our incoming superintendent. So as we've been developing the profile with Alma Advisory Group, we have also been doing research both within the state of Maine and in comparable school districts in the Northeast region to really try to understand what would make a competitive range to make sure that we're able to really attract high quality talent to our district. So given kind of the work that we've done, I'm going to start with the recommendation to have the salary range start at $170,000 for the incoming superintendent, but then also kind of walk through this research and then get questions and comments from the board to see kind of where folks are landing on this. We won't have a formal vote. This isn't a voting option, or this isn't a voting item. This is more just a discussion. So just a little bit of background. So Javier Botana's salary in his contract was $148,000, and he did not take a raise in his time here. If he had each year, including cost of living increases, those kinds of things, his salary would have been higher at the end of his tenure here. Additionally, so the incoming city manager salary range, this person has not been hired yet, but the range that they advertised that job for was 190 to 210. And this comparative chart right here is from Maine School Management. They've collected a lot of this data for us. So you can see kind of, and this is not all the schools, this is just kind of the percentile or the schools that would be above or at where our last superintendent was, with the addition of Lewiston, because the demographics in Lewiston are so similar to ours. So on the column B, you'll see the total enrollment of these schools. Lewiston is probably the closest to Maine, closest in Maine in terms of total enrollment. And the annual salary there for the superintendent is $135,000 right now. And then this over here is just the degree that's held currently. And this is from the 2023 school year. If we scroll down here, and this is all in board docs, you can see that there are 3 districts in Massachusetts that Alma felt like were comparative to Maine, to Portland Public Schools. So you'll see the school name, the county, the enrollment there. This is the current salary for their superintendents, but then we have adjusted it for the cost of living in Maine, which is, I think in Portland it's a little bit higher than the state average, but using the kind of guide work that we had, this is where it lands. So I just wanted to give folks a couple of minutes to look at this and to ask questions. Again, this would be kind of like the starting salary of the range. This likely we would end up paying the person more than this, but this is just the advertised rate that we would put in the job description. So I'm going to let's see. If you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, and I'm going to see if I can see your hand while I'm sharing my screen. Yes, Board Member Opperman.
We did not put on the profile or the description any relationship to degree, academic degree, did we?
No, but there are qualifications through having to be a Maine superintendent that get a little bit at like the amount of experience that one must have. And I believe it says advanced degree in that. I would just need to double check. But it's not in our job profile, the exact degree that someone must have. Board member Russell Butter.
Thank you, Chair. I just had a couple questions about, I was wondering when you gave the example of Superintendent Botana's salary and then not having had the raises, do you have like a guesstimate of how that would have changed over those years with with having the raise, just to get a sense of what it would have looked like?
Yeah, so I think that actually, that they would be above the 170 for sure, just given
That
cost
helps.
of living increases and, just tenure within the district.
Okay, that helps. And then I was also wondering about kind of piggybacking on Dr. Opperman's question. So when you said that might be sort of the base, but that they may be offered more, would that be dependent partly on advanced degree? Like, would there be qualifications someone would bring that then we would have a formula for what would be added to the salary?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that would just help me know kind of what range I felt good about. So that helps. Thanks.
Yeah. And just one note, and then I see your hand, Board Member Figdor, is so there was data from 2022 that showed York School Department and their superintendent was at 168. So I think just also thinking about across the state of Maine, that I would really argue that, our superintendent should be at the top of the range in Maine, given the size and complexity of our district. So just wanting to point that out as well. Board Member Figdor.
Yeah, I had a similar point to your last point, Chair, which is, just noting that in Scarborough, which is less than half the size of our district, that the salary there is 163. And given the comparables that you've provided, I'm comfortable with 170 as the low end of the range. I don't think we could go any lower.
Agreed. Any other questions? One other point that I just wanted to echo from Alma, since they're not here with us tonight, is that they did feel like that if we could have our lowest range be at 170 or 175, we would probably get into kind of like another tier of candidates, which I think is the tier that we really need to be in, again, because of the size and complexity of our district and how demanding the superintendent role is in so many ways right now. Is there anyone that feels against 170 as the bottom of our range? I'm going to ask people to raise their hand if they are against, just because I am managing so many screens. I just want to make sure to catch. Okay. Great. So then I'm going to go ahead and ask Alma to update all the places where our job posting is live with that. And then we will, when we get to the end of the search, we will vote on a formal salary. And that's when we'll revisit this and make a decision as a board. Thank you for all of your input and questions. I'm going to stop sharing. Superintendent Nally, how are we doing?
I think we can go for it. I see everybody here. Yes. Thank you.
Awesome. Perfect. Good job, everyone.
Great. So this is workshop, so a little more informal. And so basically what we wanted to do tonight, like I mentioned in the opening remarks, is share a little bit more transparency into how we do our staffing planning. And I want to acknowledge for board members who've been on the board for a while, this should be familiar. There's not much change here. So for some of you, this might be a recall. And for others, I know that this is new information. And then, of course, for the community, I'm sure people have different levels of understanding of how we approach this. So if you want to move the slide forward, Aaron. So basically, our goal is to build shared understanding around how we approach staffing based on transparent database ratios. And we'll start by talking through classroom teacher staffing, and Aaron will talk us through that. Then we'll talk about special education, and Julie Kirby, who's our Assistant Director of Student Support Services for Elementary, is here since our Director, Jesse Applegate, is still on paternity leave. And both Julie and I will together talk through the special education staffing. Carlos Gomez, our Director of Language Development, is here to talk through our ESOL staffing. And then finally, Dr. Reiger, our Director of Mental and Behavioral Health Services, will talk a little bit about the mental and behavioral health school-based allocations. As we go through this, I'd say that it's probably best, maybe after Aaron, your section, we could pause for some questions, but then I think it would be helpful to go through each of these other ratios together. I think it's helpful for you to see there's differences, but there's a coherent logic to our approach. So just suggest folks kind of take note of questions you might have. And then of course, at the end, we'll have time for questions that folks might have. Okay, great. So I think Aaron, you'll start us off.
Great. Thank you, Malia. And also want to acknowledge, and Malia, correct me if I'm wrong, I know you with members of the academic team, led some of this work in terms of establishing these kind of staffing methodologies, previously, and we've now added the kind of classroom teacher piece here as of the last year. But, there hadn't been formal established kind of methodologies to establish staffing levels previously. So this has been an effort over the past number of years to have that kind of transparency that Malia mentioned around resource allocation and ensuring we're doing it in ways that were transparent and built trust amongst, within the district and, was, efficient use and allocation of our resources. So,
yeah, I was going to say a little bit more about that when I talk through the special education, just to frame, because that's actually where we started. But yeah, that's good general context as well. Thanks.
Yep. So in terms of making determinations around our classroom teachers and the number of, FTEs or staff that we are assigning to classroom, we'll walk through how we do that. So the first piece is obviously starting with the enrollment projection. So the number of staff is necessarily tied both from a revenue perspective, but also as well from a service perspective to the number of students we have. So just briefly in terms of how we think about enrollment projections at the elementary level and at all of the levels, we roll up kind of the existing grades, the numbers in the existing grades, who will remain there. So for elementary, that's students who are currently in K4, we roll them up to grades 1 through 5. For kindergarten, we look back at a 5-year average of kindergarten enrollment to project the K enrollment. And for pre-K, those figures are capped, kind of based on our lottery. So we know what those will be. At the middle school, again, we roll up the current 6th and 7th graders to be 7th and 8th graders with those numbers. And then we do, because we're still neighborhood based at middle school, do the analysis of the geographic distribution of our current 5th graders to their enrollments in 6th grade. And at the high school, similar processes, roll up the current 9th through 11th graders to be 10th through 12th graders. And as we discussed at the last board meeting, account for and have those numbers now our incoming 9th graders based on our high school enrollment process. Member Opperman, I see you raised your hand.
Thank you, Superintendent. Just a couple questions with the projections on the 5-year average K enrollment. Was there a increasing trend in that enrollment, or was it incredibly varied so that the average is not less than the last couple years' enrollments?
We do this we do this by school, and I can follow up to share the data. So it varies by school.
I just didn't want to underestimate if there's a trend. And the other question is, since we have such a number of individuals moving into the city for various reasons, any thought about, I don't know how you do it, but potentials for transfers in as seen over the last few years?
That's a challenging thing. I think, we're anticipating talking more about that next week as one of our areas of focus. So I think I'd, kind of table that for now, but that is definitely one of the real challenges is it, in regards to both staffing and service and projections to be able to anticipate those numbers. So here, and you can see this in more detail, and we'll obviously include these in the formal budget book when that's published when we do our superintendent's update. But I won't review these in detail now, but these are the actual enrollment projections for next school year that we used as the basis for our initial run of kind of staffing allocations. And again, I'll say all of this, we're still in the process. Nothing has been finalized. What we'll bring forward to, in our recommended budget on the 14th will be kind of the initial proposal, and obviously none of it's final until we get through the process of board and council and ultimately voter approval. And maybe just if people can note, just because Member Bryden, I see your question. Let me just run through these, and then we can, take questions on any of these pieces as it relates to classroom staffing, as Superintendent Nally said. Sorry, I broke protocol earlier, so for general ed elementary, this is the place where we have had traditionally the most kind of standardization in terms of class, staffing allocation. So here it's relatively straightforward, where we manage to kind of class size numbers pretty directly. So we have the, kind of grade level enrollment, how many students are in a given grade level. We divide that by the class size maximum, and that gives us the number of FTE, the number of staff, full-time equivalent per grade level, and we round up to the nearest whole FTE. We do that so that we aren't in situations where we're having to do combo classes across grade levels or things like that. So the class size assumptions that we use to manage in that way, pre-K is set, as we know, at 16 students in a given pre-K class. Kindergarten, we currently use 20 students as the class size maximum in kindergarten. Grades 1 through 3, it's 22 students. And grades 4 to 5, it's 25 students. So in our initial run, as we're continuing to deliberate, given the adjustments made last year, we're not anticipating overall any net change in FTE at the elementary level, though there is some variation by school depending on various kind of class size changes and enrollment changes at given grade levels. In terms of elementary specials, our methodology here is, we start with these assumptions around art, music, and physical education. So, we assume that each student is having access to one of those specials per week. So 3 specials per week from the student perspective. And from a teacher perspective, those special teachers, roughly teach 5 sections per day. So we look at the total of number of classrooms at a given school, and this includes any of the pre-K classrooms that are on site or any district special education programs that are housed at a given school, to figure out how many kind of sections of specials we need to provide. So we take that total number of classrooms, multiply it by 3 specials per week, divide that by the number of specials each teacher teaches, and multiply it times 5 days per week. And that gives us our minimum number of specials teachers at each school to be able to provide that minimum of 1 section of art, 1 section of music, and 1 section of PE for each student every week. So in the context of specials, we've historically in the local budget rounded up to the nearest 0.2 FTE. So kind of pre-pandemic, that led to a fair amount of sharing across campuses for some of the specials teachers. During the period of the pandemic, initially because of health and safety concerns, and more recently to support some of the collaboration efforts, we have used some ESSER funding to kind of round up so that sites are not having to share FTE across schools primarily. So that netted out in this past year to 2.7 FTE supported by ESSER. So that's something we're considering. We'll bring forward, about whether we'll maintain that in the coming year, in terms of that addition. As we transition to middle school, our middle school model, is pretty consistent and has been for some time since we transitioned from junior high model to middle school. So at the middle school model, that really defines having 4 core teachers, science, math, English, and social studies per team. And those, can serve up to 100 students per team when we think of that 25 students per class as a maximum. Given the enrollments, at the middle schools, that maintains, likely a pretty stable staffing perspective at the middle school level for those core classroom teachers. In addition, at the middle school, we provide a variety of related arts and world language offerings. And so we use the following methodology there, which is a little bit similar to the elementary specials. So we expect, based on the kind of middle school schedules, that students have access to 2 sections of either related arts or world language on a given day. We use the class size average again at the secondary level of 25. And those teachers, kind of our working assumption, similar to the core content, teachers teach 4 sections per day. So to determine the number of FTE, we take the total enrollment at a given school, multiply that by the number of sections per day, divide that by the class size average, and the number of sections per teacher to give us how many FTE we need to provide all students at a given school with 2 sections a day of related arts or world language programming. So based on that, we're not seeing significant shifts in our middle school enrollments. So potentially we won't have any, change around related arts or world language staffing at the middle school level. And lastly, just 2 slides on the high school level and then take questions. So at the high school level, this was the first year, last year was the first year we, had this kind of formal methodology. And so we, start from these assumptions. So first, again, continuing that expectation of approximately 25 students, as kind of the class size average. We recognize, there are some like PE that at times are larger and some others that are smaller. So we use that class size average. Based on the schedules at the schools, the assumptions are, and for students, that students have 8 classes at both Deering or Portland, that need to be filled on their schedules, 8 sections, at Casco Bay at 6. And so consequently, in terms of teachers, to provide them with, the appropriate planning time and so forth, teachers teach 6 sections at Deering and Portland, and Casco Bay, the expectation is that teachers are teaching 4. So we use a similar methodology as I described around the middle school related arts and world language, where we take the overall total enrollment, multiply it by the number of classes per student. That really just gives us like how many sections we need to ensure we're providing coverage for, and then divide that by the class size and the number of sections per teacher to say how many teachers we would need. So given some of our increases there, as we'll see, and as people may be familiar, last year, the Casco Bay didn't increase based on the formula. We allocated some other increases for them, but there is a potential increase overall at the high school level of 6 FTE, 6 and a little bit, though there is potential variation by site in terms of increases or potentially small reductions that we may consider or in the middle of considering. So that is the base staffing. So what's the minimum number, kind of regardless of kind of student need. So at the high school level, because we don't have additional resources that, historically have been invested based on student need, whereas at the elementary level, our title funds are used to kind of supplement based on student need. Our middle school model increases our investment in terms of supporting students at the middle school level. Last year, we proposed what we referred to as the equity enhancement at high school. So what this does is tries to account for students who qualify qualify as students who qualify for either as economically disadvantaged, students who receive special education services, or students who receive English language services. So, we refer to that as an unduplicated student count. So a student who may qualify for one or more of those is only counted once. Similar to how it's reflected in the state EPS formula and in other formulas across the country. We did a little bit of field research last year in establishing this. We kind of do an additive for the enrollments. So essentially of kind of 20%. So we increase, the enrollment at a given school, and we multiply 1.2 times that unduplicated count. So the number of students who qualify for one or more of those categories that I mentioned, and then add that to the non-identified count to get their adjusted enrollment. So with that adjusted enrollment, we use the same formula as the base staffing to determine how many additional FTE based on student need we potentially would allocate to to our high schools. So overall, that reflects based on our incoming classes. So we've calculated those unduplicated counts with the rising ninth grade class, that would reflect potentially as many as 12 FTE above the base staffing level that I referred to previously, which just in comparison to what was incorporated last year in the equity enhancement that we have had this year is an increase of only 0.5 FTE from last year. So just want to clarify that's not an overall increase of 12 FTE, but and we may not move forward with it, though we're still in deliberations, but just for kind of comparative purposes, it reflects a relatively significant increase, and that increase varies by school based on their unduplicated counts at a given school. So those are some of the methodologies that we have used to determine classroom teacher allocation across the various grade spans. So let me pause here before we continue to some of the other realms. I know Member Bryden, you had a question, and I believe I see Member Opperman with your hand raised. So Member Bryden?
Thank you. I actually now have more questions because I was adding to them while you were talking. So what prompted me to raise my hand was on the slide with the grid of all the elementary schools and the kids per grade and then the totals. And I'm curious because I noticed the variation in totals across schools, and I'm curious about whether the schools with a higher enrollment whether they have the capacity, like bigger building and whether the smaller enrollment schools are similarly aligned, or whether there's a need to, look at whether the geographic lines are drawn appropriately in terms of which kids live where.
So is your question essentially like, are we at capacity from a facility standpoint at some schools? And or under capacity at other schools? Yeah,
I mean, there was at least one that was 200 something and one that was 500 something. And so, I mean, I'm sure the buildings aren't all the exact same square footage, but
yep.
Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so briefly, and we are kind of in the final stages, I'll say, with, I believe it's Davis Demographics doing, a revised version of our kind of enrollment projections, multi-year enrollment projections. So we do anticipate at some point this spring being able to do a follow-up workshop around that, which, for folks that remember, I think, I'm not sure, frankly, who was on the board, Member Figdor or Member Bondo, maybe, when the enrollment and facilities study happened in, 2018, 2019. So we'll be kind of refreshing some of that. We haven't done an additional facilities enrollment, but I would say, there is a bit of variation right now. We are seeing kind of at capacity mostly at some of our schools on the perimeter. So I would say Lyseth, Rowe, as well as East Ender schools, this year we're experiencing kind of capacity issues with, certainly at Reiki as well. I mean, obviously they've been under construction. In the lower enrollment schools of Longfellow, in particular, and Presumpscot, certainly Presumpscot hasn't had any additional classroom space because of their construction. We're opening a few new spaces, but we anticipate the opportunity to fill those. And Longfellow is one that is part of our discussions right now. It is, we allocated resources there a few years ago for it to be a McKinney-Vento receiving school. And so we are, directing students there currently. And it's a consideration for us where that is the place, I would say, more than really any other, where there's a consideration of whether there's, we're under capacity there and will be post-construction.
Okay. Thank you. So the next slide with the information about class sizes at the elementary level, I just need to voice that I think 22 first graders with one teacher is just a lot. It's a lot. It sounds like a lot. And it doesn't, I have questions about the experience of those 23 people. I noticed that I think if I'm remembering correctly, the fourth and fifth grade classrooms are listed as 25, which is the same as the average class size in high school, which I understand it's different because you're looking at average, but I just wanted to call that out as just letting you know that I had a visceral reaction to that. And so I'm curious, just generally speaking, I don't need I don't need the data in a granular way, but anecdotally, how often are we having a first grade classroom with 22 kids?
We'll have, when we produce this, you'll see the projected class size ratios. We have a number of that are close to that. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but certainly, we manage to that. And, some of our schools, particularly those that have been taking in, our new arrivals, have increased to those numbers. So it's not uncommon, I should say. We have some schools that are certainly less, but, when we get to the proposed budget, we'll provide, kind of the projected class size averages.
Okay.
Can I pop in here?
I have a couple more.
It's the same question on the same thing. I just was wanting to ask if it's EPS agrees with these numbers. That's all I wanted to ask.
No, I believe the EPS numbers are higher. And so these are lower thresholds that we have historically managed towards.
Thank you. Sorry, Sarah.
Oh, I'm learning so much. Thank you for that. Superintendent Townsend, I heard you say that when you were talking about the specials, I heard you say that something about not sharing FTEs across sites, and I'm curious about. I'm not saying I think we should have people driving across the city to various schools. That's not my goal. But I'm curious about whether that is something that we could explore as a strategy if we need to. Is it something that has been done in the past and we've?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And then my last question, and then I'll let others take up the mantle of asking questions. But my last question is on the high school slides around equity enhancements for teaching staff. I'm curious about whether that can also be implemented for co-curriculars and other building related costs.
We have not applied it in that manner thus far. So we potentially could explore that, but we haven't applied the methodology beyond, kind of FTE staffing.
Okay. So yeah, I'd be interested in exploring application of that to the other costs as well. Thanks so much.
Great. I don't know if Chair Lentz, I can't quite see everybody. I wasn't tracking.
Yes, I can track for you. Board Member Opperman.
Board Member Bryden pretty much covered things, but again, are all of the numbers in the middle school and high school sizes below EPS values currently? I know I don't have the current EPS calculation, but I know that quite a few years ago, our EPS numbers were smaller, like 16-1 for elementary, which is for elementary is a much more reasonable number. High school, I agree with Financial Chair Bryden that it's 25 at high school be fine, but that's just been my comment on those. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Board Member Opperman. And I just just had a couple of questions. I know, Erin, you spoke to kind of being able to have title funding in the elementary schools and other funding at the middle school level in terms of equity enhancements, but are they applied in the same kind of formula? Or could you talk a little bit more about what that looks like at the elementary and middle schools? And I'm not sure if Board Member Bryden's question was inclusive of specials as well. So I'm curious about how that is part of elementary and middle school staffing.
Sure, I'll start, and then Superintendent Nally, if you want to weigh in. Yeah. Appreciate it. But so one, just to clarify, our title funds, we a number of years ago made the decision to direct those to the elementary school. So the additional investment in the middle school does not come from our title funds, at least from our Title I funds. Those have been local commitments that we've made to the middle school model versus a junior high model. A junior high model would replicate, kind of the high school formula in terms of, the teaming structure is one of the core elements of the middle school model. And as a result, that really suppresses suppresses the staffing because it introduces kind of a structure of those teams and the four core teachers that share a group of students. So it's a little more rigid, but, also increases, has benefits as well in terms of personalization and connection and relationship that they're able to build. So it's been that way for, frankly, I'm not sure how many years, a long time. That was the middle school model. When I was a middle school teacher, was kind of how things were organized. So the middle school movement, has been in place for some time. So just to clarify that as it relates to middle school, in terms of elementary, there's a methodology. Our kind of academic director of resource strategy, Gail Cressy, helps to really manage, our Title I investments at the elementary schools and works closely with those building leaders. The amount of Title I resources at a given school is determined actually overall by census count, not necessarily by the free and reduced lunch counts. So the number of resources in those get kind of, we get that overall as a district, and then it's divided up amongst the schools based on kind of the proportion. So schools with higher percentages receive more of those Title I resources and then make determinations at the site level about how to utilize those resources. And so that often looks like potentially historically, we've invested some in either literacy or math coaches. There have been intervention positions, both teaching or ed tech positions has been kind of common. And in some places, we've used those to support social, emotional, mental and behavioral health positions as well. So typically it reflects those, so does not contribute to investments in special staffing. Malia, anything you would add to that?
Just two small things. I think we can have Gail clarify further if people are interested in the future, but I think, and this is something I would want Gail to confirm, but to your point about the funding, she said you nailed it. I'll say this out loud and then text me back, Gail, but I think that it's based on the census data, but my understanding was that then the formula that figures out the allocation with our schools does get more connected to the free and reduced lunch data. Yes, she said I'm correct on that. So I do want to make that point clear because we make it a total amount, but we do have some schools that are at risk of losing title funding in part because their FRL numbers aren't, reflecting that they would fit into the sort of distribution formula, if you will. And then I think another good just example of how title funding is used, you did a great job, Erin, but most of our literacy coaches, for example, are also funded out of title. So just wanted to acknowledge that, a lot of some of these bodies of work we've been trying to advance in terms of instructional improvement are not in our local budget. They end up getting grant funded.
And I'll just acknowledge as we move through the budget process for, newer board members, the title, the amount of title funding and how it's allocated is somewhat of a lagging process to our local budget, timeline. So that's one of the challenges we manage kind of annually in terms of things that sites have been able to maintain in title funds and questions about whether they'll be able to sustain those or not. So that'll come up in some of our discussions as we move forward.
Thank you. Board Member Russell-Better.
Thank you. I think part of my question was what Chair Lentz brought up, Superintendent Townsend. So I think you answered some of it. I guess I was just wanting to piggyback. I think I had an understanding. You clarified some further about Title I funding, but I guess I'm just curious, not for this budget year right now, but just this model with the equity enhancement at the high school level. I'm just wondering, has there been any looking at that for elementary level? Like, is that an option, just as we're talking about, Sarah Bryden's point about number of students, and you think about the number of students with, complex needs with our, newcomer students, McKinney-Vento. I just was curious about, this kind of a formula in addition to that. Like, has that been considered just out of curiosity? Or does that seem like a, doable thing to consider?
I guess I would say that would require additional local resources, right? So that's one challenge given our current budget climate. I would say we proposed it at the high school level because there was not any methodology to account for student need at the high school level in the staffing. Historically, there was no methodology around high school staffing. We just kind of rolled over what folks had, and that did not formally account, at least from a general education setting, student need. So the title funds are intended explicitly to do that. So I would argue that, that is the mechanism by which we do that. And fortunately, we have federal funds that are able to support that. So, and investing in our learners at an early age, right, to set them on the pathway for success is obviously, a kind of key resource. We know, right, the research about pre-K and the importance there. And so that kind of flows in terms of our, choices to use the title funds at the elementary level to ensure, that strong start for students. But so this is really was, I think we proposed this, to kind of make up for a lack of investment based on student need at the high school. And so I would not recommend proposing adding that at the elementary level. I think we would reconsider, if that was the case, if we were to look at that, and I don't know what the costs associated with that would be. We certainly haven't run those kinds of calculations. It would be significant, I would imagine. We would also want to re-examine kind of the distribution of our title dollars, because this is essentially intended to be a kind of complement at the high school level to those title dollars.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, certainly, for this budget year wasn't, thinking this would make any sense, but just kind of trying to understand how the number of students, just like, say one classroom in one building, 22 students might feel reasonable, but in another setting of, student needs, it just seems like having some sort of way to, account for that might be helpful. So it's just kind of trying to, but that helps Superintendent to.
And I'll say, the subsequent sections of the presentation here, as we get into special ed staffing, ELL staffing, right? Those are ways, again, so this is not the only way that we account for student need and the staffing to support students to be successful. Those are important elements of our process as well. And those are reflective of student need, as we'll talk about across grade spans.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Vice Chair Bondo?
Thank you, Chair. Right. Most of my questions have been answered. So I just want to emphasize on the class size ratio for elementary school. Having all the time struggle with this, to have some of those schools having a lot of students. And when I heard you say about adding, then we have a lot of increase of the new arrivals. So I'm kind of a little curious, like, when we're going to project for the budget, can we have a more precise on the as the type, because the title funding, some of the building we lose the title fundings, and what kind of impact is going to play on the class size ratio? Because if I remember, some of our buildings, they have like East End, they have a lot of like a special ed education program. So we have a more program on different building than the other ones. So can we just look at it and see if some of those buildings are not losing the title fund? Do they have a capacity on using under those fundings to increase capacity building, like, some class size, some adding some class, so we can balance the ratio of the students? So in each, especially elementary school, and I look at 3 buildings like Reki, Presumcut, and East End School.
Yeah. It's occurring to me that this may be a good subject to go a little deeper in a finance committee meeting around the title funding. So, I think there are choices, that Gail works with each of our building leaders on, about what is the most effective kind of, distribution of that. There are facilities constraints in some of those buildings about whether they could add additional classrooms to kind of reduce class size, right? By those dollars, by utilizing the federal kind of title dollars. So there's some practical constraints to that as well, that are a part of the calculation of how those get utilized to be able to support students effectively. But yeah, I think it'd be good to bring forward a little bit, certainly raising these questions around the connection to the title resources and how those are utilized. So we can look at what'll be the best way to kind of bring that forward, so you all can have insight into utilization of those resources and how they're distributed as we move through the budget process. And while it won't be final as we move through, but can anticipate, how those resources might get distributed and, what that might support at given schools as you make decisions around the local budget.
Okay. Sounds good. Thank you so much.
Sure thing.
Chair.
Board Member Opperman?
Thank you, Chair. I have a question about free and reduced lunch, and I'm glad you're saying to bring it to the Finance Committee. And I understand, because high school students tend not to get those forms filled out for free and reduced lunch. My question has to do with there are, I guess, a couple forms for that. One is an actual recording of your income. Is that still? And then there's one where you just, for economic disadvantage situation, the parent just checks off something and names the children and signs it to say that, yes, we are eligible because of these various grid of dollars and size of class, size of family income. So with that said, and that is what the Title I is coming from. With that said, with McKinney-Vento students, are they automatically put into economic disadvantage, particularly if they don't have a parental situation?
Go ahead, Molly.
Well, I just I would maybe propose that we do a comprehensive update on this, and Gail's texting me, would be happy to help do this. I just think maybe it would be helpful to you all to kind of have it be done more fully with the expert in the room.
I think that would be great.
So I will note that Gail's already planning on it, and then we'll figure out with Finance Chair Bryden how we fit that into our agenda, because these are good questions. I just want to make sure, I think we'll be more efficient and effective at answering your questions if we can kind of prepare well for it and have Gail here.
And just one quick note, and then Board Member Figdor, you're up next. But just as, the reporting of free and reduced lunch has gone down, like thinking about forecasting past this budget, how that's going to impact us. So if that could be part of that conversation, that would be great. Thank you. Board Member Figdor.
Thank you, Chair. I was wondering if one of the superintendents can talk about how not sharing elementary school specials has enabled more more collaboration time among teachers?
Sure. Happy to. Thank you, Member Figdor. In general, I mean, what that has meant. So first, for example, a school like Rowe, where prior to the pandemic, the question, I think it was Member Russell Better had asked if this had happened before. It did. They had their PE teacher was 0.8, so 4 days a week at Rowe and 1 day a week supporting breathe day treatment, actually, in that context. And they had another teacher, their music teacher that, Reiki is another good example where they had a PE teacher that was at Reiki 4 days a week and was 1 day a week supporting the island schools. And they had a music teacher that did the same. And then their art teacher, supported, I'm forgetting exactly where, but anyway, for example, so now what we've done is kind of round those up. So instead of, the Reiki PE teacher being only 4 days a week at Reiki, now we added the additional 0.2. So those little fractional increases so that they are full-time at Reiki. So that's, and similarly with the other positions. So essentially at all of our elementary schools, except for, Longfellow and Presumpscot, because of their overall numbers. Each school with a combination of local funds and the additions from ESSERF have a full-time PE, full-time music, and full-time art teacher at the school. So that's enabled additional sections of enabled schools to offer additional sections of those classes, which in turn creates additional opportunities for collaboration time. We know our elementary school teachers have the least planning time compared to middle school and high school, their secondary colleagues. So it's created additional pockets of collaboration time or planning time for those teachers. And in terms of, it's allowed them to be fully committed. I mean, not that they've always been fully committed, staff, but fully immersed in those school communities and not split amongst multiple school communities. So it's enabled from a school management perspective and a school culture perspective, significant benefits and flexibility in terms of, various, kind of programmatic things that might be happening, and as well for those staff members to be fully present within those school communities on a day-to-day basis. So, and certainly, with our sub challenges and so forth, that additionally just provides some of that additional extra capacity at the site level that offers flexibility. So it's able to create pockets of collaboration amongst grade level teams or, grade level teams with EL teachers or special education teachers as part of our kind of co-teaching work as we've been trying to do more push-in work, but also additional kind of planning time. So, those examples where instead of, that teacher getting on the boat and scurrying to Peaks and then Cliff in a given day, they're able to spend that additional time at Reiki, providing additional PE support there, and thus kind of taking kids from the general education teachers.
Thank you.
Awesome. And just kind of in our listening sessions, have heard from those staff how much different and better it feels to be in one location, how they can deepen their relationships, how it feels more fulfilling. So that feels like a really good change for those staff in those positions.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any more questions right now. So let's move to the next section. Great. If you're ready.
Yes, absolutely. So like I said, my recommendation is going to be that we step through special education, ESOL staffing, and behavioral health staffing together. And so just note your questions, and then we can kind of zoom back out and take questions. And just to be clear, in terms of introductions, Julie Kirby, if you want to wave, is here. Like I said, she's one of our assistant directors, and Carlos Gomez, who's shared multiple times, as well as Dr. Reiger. So we're going to start with special education. So Erin mentioned this at the beginning, and I was going to talk a little bit about this here, which is when we started the Portland Promise, one of the things that, was happening that Javier and I would talk about is people would frequently request additional staff, but there wasn't a consistent, predictable, and transparent methodology that we could look to. So people would sort of advocate their rationale, but it felt like it was kind of done in a bit of a vacuum. And so it was hard to see, well, what's the full picture? Do we need to add staff? Can we reallocate staff? Yes or no? And then this is a compelling rationale. Rarely, if ever, is there not a compelling rationale when somebody's trying to advocate for a position. But what's the rhyme or reason to how we might go about making that decision? So certain elements were in place, like that elementary class size methodology, but we did not have a clear methodology for that was transparent to everybody in terms of special education and ELL staffing and behavioral health. And so we went about trying to develop that, starting with special education, and then we added the ELL staffing as well as the behavioral health. And for all of these, we did external research. We looked at kind of what guidelines exist within the state, what best practice exists, and then what are the compelling and important variables and factors for us here in Portland that we want to be considering. And then you'll see in all cases, we have staffing spreadsheets that look at student numbers, the kind of related variables about those students, apply these ratios. And so not only does this help us plan and allocate resources well, it also creates transparency. And that's super important because we don't want this to feel like, Erin and I are sitting up here making our own kind of decisions behind the curtain. This is the data. These are the kids. This is the context. This is the methodology. We want all of our leaders and people to be able to understand that. So with the goal of kind of building some trust and transparency with that. So that's just some context I wanted to share. So you can forward to Erin for special ed. So in terms of special education staffing, there are a lot of staff within special education. And so we think about this in 4 different ways. And tonight we're going to talk about these first 2. So the resource level services, the specialized programs we have, and then we also look at staffing in terms of adult support for behavior or other needs. So these are like one-on-ones and BHPs. Those are above and beyond what's planned in these top 2 categories that Julie and I will step you through tonight. And then finally, we're looking at the specialists like speech, OT, PT, and those also have kind of external best practice recommendations around caseload ratios and things like that. So to start with, I'm actually going to start us on the resource level positions. You can move us forward, Erin. And actually, Julie and I are going to do this together. So we start with like a broad student to teacher ratio. And again, this is special education, so it kind of gets individualized, but we're trying to start with some broad kind of methodology here. So Julie, can you actually speak briefly to these first couple bullets as far as why we get to the 1 to 20 / 1 to 7, et cetera here?
Yeah, so thanks, Malia. So over time, the special education department looked at the workload of the teachers and then the student need in order to determine what those ratios should be from the student to teacher ratios. And the ratios that we had come up with are actually significantly smaller than the guidelines set forth by the state guidelines. And then the special education teachers, not only provide, so as we were figuring out what should those ratios be, they don't only provide the instruction to students, whether that be push into the classroom or small groups in the resource room, but they also provide they're also the student's case manager for special education. So as the case manager, they're scheduling, attending, and facilitating all IEP meetings for their students on their caseload, along with completing all of the necessary special education legal paperwork that's required. And then when you look at the special education ratio in elementary versus secondary, similar to what Erin was showing earlier, the ratio is slightly lower in elementary schools. And we found that there was a need just due to the greater need of students in those lower grade levels. So when you look at the second set of bullets for elementary 1 to 7, middle school 1 to 10, and high school 1 to 12, those are the total number of special education staff in that building, thinking of teachers and ed techs combined. So in an elementary school, if you had 21 students, or that may not be a good example. If you had 40 students, you'd have at least, 2 special education teachers, and you'd have, you'd probably have three or four special education ed techs. So then, when you have a ratio, you'd have a 1-to-7 ratio or so. And that wasn't a really good example, but
good math on the fly, Julie.
yeah, not really.
Do you want me to pick it back up from here then?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Okay. So just to underscore, and this member Opperman was to your previous question. So again, our ratios are much lower than what the state asserts or recommends in terms of what we've modeled here in Portland. And then again, this is kind of the baseline, does not account for full-time one-to-one adult support. So that would be added in addition to, nor does this scoop in the teachers who are in a building if there's a specialized program like a bridge or a beach, which we'll talk about in a moment. And so the other thing we wanted to highlight for you in terms of the methodology is that it gets more nuanced. So we use a weighted formula to determine these ratios. And this weight acknowledges that certain disability categories require more capacity. So this is something we developed based on some research we did with multiple other districts across the country. So we looked at lots of other states, we looked at lots of other districts, we met with heads of academics and special education in different places. Madison, Wisconsin actually was one of the districts that consulted with us on this. So this is a typical approach, which is to acknowledge, again, some disability types do require more time and capacity typically. So that gets baked into the methodology. And then when we do this at this time of the year, we do incorporate projections for next year into the formula as far as staffing goes. So if you forward it to the next slide, I'm going to give you one example. So by no means do we expect you to be able to read this. This is more just to show this is a portion of this gigantic spreadsheet that I mentioned we make transparent to our administrative team so that everybody can kind of have visibility into this. So you probably can't see this, but as an example, at the top is our East End Community School. So we start with the total number of students in resource at that school, which in this case is 36. Then to the point I made that we are looking at projections for next year, we're cognizant of the fact that we have 9 students in referral at this point. And so we take 75% of the students with active referrals and add that to the number. And that's based on historic data around the percent of students that typically end up identified through the referral process. Then we calculate in the disability weight that I just mentioned. So you can see over on the right-hand side, you probably can't see the specifics, but those are all columns that are those disability category weights. And so right now for East End, instead of 36 students to plan for, we're looking at 45.8. We add an additional weight for students who are dually identified with English language learning. And then we get our total weighted students. So from East End, that then we're planning for 46.5 students. Okay, so just wanting to be really clear, we really are trying to be super intentional about providing sufficient resourcing for these students. And so then from there, some of these columns look at, okay, now if you were to apply, in the case of East End, an assumption that they would have a 1-to-7 ratio of adult to students, then how many teachers and how many ed techs should they have in the building? Okay, so that's the approach we take to this school by school resource planning. And so next, we take a slightly different approach for our specialized programs because there's more of a model there. And so Julie's going to step you through Beach, Bridge, and Breathe.
Yeah, great. Thanks. So we have so all of our programs are K-12 that Malia just mentioned. And so I'll walk you through each one of them. So our Beach program is our autism program. And those students we're working on supporting their behavioral, emotional, academic, communication, and hygiene needs of all students with autism who would be in that program, not all students in the district. And then the Beach program also can offer and provide consultation and professional development and work collaboratively with schools to meet the needs of students throughout the district. And then, so looking at the elementary school level, we have 2 classrooms at the Ocean Avenue Elementary School. And within that, we have a capacity of about 14 students. There are 2 classrooms, so 2 special education teachers, one for each of those classrooms, with 13 ed techs allocated. And then within that program, there's also a dedicated speech and language pathologist, and then a large percentage of support from the occupational and physical therapists as well. When we think about the secondary level, there's 1 classroom at each one middle school and 1 high school. So at Lincoln, we have 1 classroom with the capacity of about 7 students, 1 special ed teacher, 2 ed techs, a social worker with a big presence, and then the related services are just based upon the student needs within the program. And then very similarly at Portland High School as well, we have 1 classroom with the capacity of about 12 students, 3 ed techs. So therefore, adding another ed tech with the big presence of social work. Next slide, Erin. Moving on to the functional life skills program. So in the elementary school level, we call that, its name is Bridge. And so within the functional life skills, again, K to 12, supporting students throughout the district. And these students have significant developmental disabilities. Like they could have autism, they could have multiple disabilities, and orthopedic impairment and intellectual disability, those types of disabilities. These students generally have limited functional communication and self-care skills. And then they will also most likely, if they don't already, have an intellectual disability. Not all, but a good portion of them, a good percentage. And then within the elementary school, we have 2 classrooms, so very similar to the Beach classroom. There are 2 classrooms that service about 14 students. There are 2 special education teachers, 1 for each classroom. 14 ed techs allocated. Same with Beach, a dedicated speech and language pathologist. There's also a half-time social worker allocated to the program, and then a large percentage of support from occupational therapists and physical therapists.
Julie, can I just quickly pause you? And
sure.
I just make sure this is clear to folks that it's not 14 students per class, it's 14 students total.
Thank you.
And
Laura.
that was the case with Beach as well. So when you're looking at this, there are 14 students and we have 14, 15, 16, 17.5 adults allocated for those 14 students. And then on top of that, the occupational and physical therapy capacity.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for making that. And then for the secondary level, there's 1 classroom at the middle school with the capacity for that 1 classroom with about 8 students. Same 1 special ed teacher, 5 ed techs, and then the related services are based upon their IEP needs. And then at Deering, there are 2 classrooms with the capacity of 14 total. So about 7 in each classroom are assigned to each of the 2 special ed teachers and 8 ed techs. So the need for one-to-one support goes down slightly as we get to higher grade levels. Next slide. Erin, thank you. And then the last district program is split into 2 different areas. So it's our behavioral health, our Breathe behavioral health continuum. And so same with the other 2 programs, it's kindergarten through grade 12. And this program supports students in the need of their behavioral health intervention, so their emotional disturbance or other health impairments. The Breathe Continuum provides a high quality academic, social, emotional, and behavioral health interventions that create and sustain the conditions that empower students to access their education. And so in this program, the support classrooms began in the 1920 school year. And so this part is fairly new. And there's 2 elementary sites, 1 at East End and 1 at Rowe. And again, 2 classrooms per school. And the capacity in each of those classrooms is 11. So when you look at each school, it's 22 students capacity. But at each school, you'd have 2 special education teachers, 8 ed techs total. So, essentially 4 ed techs in each classroom, 1 dedicated social worker for both of those classrooms at 1 school. So, East End, there would be 2 teachers, 8 ed techs, 1 social worker. And then the related services are based upon IEP need. At the middle school level, there's one classroom for each middle school, with the capacity of 11 students at each of those middle schools. One special ed teacher, 3 ed techs are allocated, and 1 dedicated social worker for that classroom at the middle schools, each middle school. And then there is a Breeze support classroom at both Deering and Portland High School with that same model as the middle school. So 11 students total in each of those schools, in each classroom at each school, 1 teacher, 3 ed techs, and a dedicated social worker. And then the last part of the Breathe Continuum is our self-contained program. And so this program, is for students that are struggling with social emotional disabilities, that provides a really therapeutic intervention that will help them transition back into the mainstream. So the goal is that they can go back to maybe Breathe support or back into resource. The goal wouldn't be for them to be in this program for a significant amount of time. And so there is a program at Lyman Moore Middle School, and it's a K-8 program. There are 3 classrooms there with the capacity of 24 students total between those 3 classrooms. So there are 3 teachers for each of those classrooms, 7 ed techs total, and then 2 dedicated social workers. And then the related services are based upon student need. And at the high school level, there's 1 classroom at Deering High School with the capacity of about 8 students. Again, 1 classroom. So 1 special ed teacher, 3 ed techs, and 1 dedicated social worker. And that's
Thank
it.
you, Julie.
No problem.
Great. So next, Carlos is going to step you through both. The next 2 are shorter because it's just looking at the methodology, but he'll talk about our ESOL teacher staffing strategy.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. So what you see in front of you is essentially the ratios of our ESOL, English to speakers of other languages, teaching and staffing ratios going into this current school year. So we're looking predominantly at 2 things. One is the ESOL teacher to student ratio. That's the first section there. And then the second section is ESOL staff, which includes teachers and language acquisition ed techs. So looking at the teachers for a moment, we have different ratios depending on the age development of the students. So at pre-K, our ratios are smaller, gradually getting larger going into elementary and secondary. So when we look at these ratios, we're looking at the teacher's role, the ESOL teacher's role, which predominantly is instruction and assessment in language, English instruction and assessment, collaboration with the general ed classroom teacher, and case management of the multilingual students, which predominantly is developing and monitoring the individual language plan. So those numbers that you see at the top are just for teacher to student ratio. As some schools have more students, more multilingual students, we start to factor in the language acquisition ed techs. These are ed techs who are bilingual, predominantly in our high language needs. So that would be Portuguese, Spanish, French, Lingala at this point, although we have other languages represented as well. And we try to focus the ed techs to the elementary level, since the younger students are having perhaps a more challenging transition to American schools. So the ed techs help them with that transition, ensure that they feel comfortable in the language, that they understand the classroom procedures, the school safety procedures, and that they are gradually feeling welcome as they begin to develop their English language. So as I mentioned, these are ratios that we went into the school year. These are the ratios we used at the beginning of the school year. As you know, and as you've heard, and as you will hear again next week when Grace Valenzuela presents to you the current numbers coming in through our multilingual center. The number of multilingual learners has been increasing at unprecedented levels. And the level of English language proficiency has gradually changed over the last couple of years. So I'm going to talk about that in just a moment. But, this influx and entrance of students is a complicating factor that we have to adjust for in the middle of the school year often. So we are making adjustments to where staffing is located to remain within these ratios. At times, we're also have some additions, usually 1 year onlys to again keep us within the ratios that we set there. But I would say we're probably closer overall of 30-1 multilingual students to ESOL teachers, and these are the numbers that we're looking at to project into the following school year. So if we look at the next slide, please, Aaron, you see on the right there a snapshot of the spreadsheet that we use with principals. So we meet with principals at the beginning of the school year in August, make some adjustments. We meet with them again in January and in May, always trying to see what the current reality is in each school at that time. So the methodologies that we use for staffing are based in the Portland Public School LAU plan, which hopefully you've heard about. It is our legal obligations, moral obligations to our multilingual learners to ensure that they are having the same academic opportunities for academic achievement and that they are receiving English language development and instruction. So that is our driving document. We also incorporate recommendations from the Center for Applied Linguistics audit that was done a few years ago to help us think how we are serving our multilingual learners. And we're always using the more recent research-based practices, high leverage principles for teaching multilingual learners. Those are all the factors that that we consider in our programming and in our staffing. I do want to highlight a key thing that I just mentioned earlier, but want to make sure that you're clear on. We do consider our English proficiency levels of our students when we do our staffing. So IELD students, intensive English language development. This is for students who have beginning level, entry level English. They may have multiple languages, but in English, they might be at a 1 or a 2 on the access test or screener. And as the name would imply, it is intensive English. So it is more time with an ESOL teacher in order to get to conversational English, in order to ensure that entrance happens rapidly and smoothly. And then eventually students will get to the CALS level, so the Cognitive Academic Language Skills level. So this is direct English instruction, less intensive than level 1s and 2s, but still factors in the fact that students may be at conversational English, but are expanding their academic language and vocabulary. So it's less intensive, but we do look at those numbers when we consider our ESOL staffing. And then a couple of other factors that really recognize the difference in our multilingual learners. So not all multilingual learners are the same, nor do they require the same amount of support or resource. As I mentioned, and we're constantly monitoring the intake trends and demographics. So, for example, this last month in January, we saw an additional 70 multilingual students arrive to Portland Public Schools for the first time, and we are, considering that as we factor our ESOL staffing. We're also looking at the number of McKinney-Vento multilingual students, and which are the home languages. As I mentioned, Portuguese is the largest group right now. So as we factor in language acquisition ed techs, we're monitoring for students and schools who have a high concentration of specific languages and try to allocate our resources in that direction. Another factor that we consider are the younger students. So we know that kindergartners, schools with large number of multilingual students in kindergarten will require more intensive staffing for ESOL teaching. As you heard from Julie earlier, our multilingual students with IEPs who are dual identified are also considered, and our students with limited or interrupted formal education. So their literacy levels in their home language also factor into the literacy and numeracy support and how our ESOL staff is factored in there. And then finally, we're also considering students who have been receiving English language development services for 5 or more years, that they have some unique needs and need some unique supports that we consider as well. So it's a moving picture. This is a population that is the fastest growing in our school district and the one that presents the most immediate needs for shifting on a monthly, quarterly, trimesterly, semesterly basis. So we're constantly monitoring it, and we're trying to stay within those ratios. And it's a delicate balancing act, but it's something that we do collaboratively, and using this methodology, hopefully, as Superintendent Nally mentioned, it's something that we are doing in a transparent way with all schools.
Thank you, Carlos. Great. And so the final one is a little less complex than the special education and ESOL staffing, and that's behavioral health. So Chris, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, great. Good evening, everyone. Yes, a little bit more straightforward, but still complicated. Well, we ground ourselves in recommendations based from the National Association of School Social Workers and the National Association of Social Workers, as well as the American School Counselor Association, which is generally 250 students to one social worker, 250 students to one counselor. We have both in several of our schools, so we have to kind of manage this a little bit differently. They also indicate that if you're working with, intensive needs, students with intensive needs, that they recommend a ratio of 1 to 50. That intensive needs is not a well-defined construct. Though, just to note, like Breathe and Bridge are well below the 1 to 50 ratios. Beach is higher, but those students are served by several different specialists as well. So that's just kind of the beginning. The next slide is, just for I'm looking at my slide deck, but I'm also looking at the presentation at the same time, so it's a little bit. We look at several kind of staff to student ratio breakdowns, and for the purpose of this, I'll just kind of bring forward two, one of which is mental health behavioral professionals that can provide IEP services with IEP related goals. So what's the caseload of someone serving students whose their services are written in for student IEPs? And the only two roles that can provide IEP-related services are school social workers and licensed clinical professional counselors, LCPCs. So that range we look at, we want to be well below one practitioner to 50 students, and the range there is currently 1 to 10 students, all the way up to 1 to 27-ish is the high range. But we also look at all of the behavioral health, mental health professionals and student ratio. And so along with social workers and LCPCs, that we have school counselors at all levels, not in all of our elementary schools, but and we also have a few social emotional learning coaches. And so we also look at the ratio of all those folks whose job it is around supporting the behavioral and mental health needs of students, and the ratio of enrollment, minus students from specialized programs. And those weights are a little bit different. The counselor weight at the high school level their FTE is weighted differently, in part because what they do is a little bit different than the elementary and middle school counselors, and addressing the mental health and behavioral health needs of students does not kind of capture the scope of their work in its entirety. And so their FTE is lower for the purposes of our ratios. I think that's all I have.
Great. Thank you, Chris. So we can probably take it off slides. Yeah. Thanks, Erin. So yeah, we're open to questions pertaining to these staffing methodologies for special education, language development, and behavioral health. Yeah, Sarah.
Thank you. Is it appropriate to compare class size in general ed to ratios in other programs, or should those numbers not be compared?
I mean, there's a different logic to that, and the scope or nature of the positions are different. So what we tried to do is give you the sort of background rationale to how we come to the assumptions we come to. And it's different work. And so I don't know that I would necessarily compare it that way, but then ultimately what you're looking at is you put together all of this stuff to get, a more complete and total picture of staffing in a given building. And that's something that we're trying to pull together. So there's some transparency into that for board members as well.
Okay, thank you. Do you want me to call in folks, or do you want to do that?
Now that I can see the whole screen and we're just in workshop, I'm happy to do that unless you prefer. Okay,
no,
great.
Let me know if you want me to pin.
Okay, thanks. Member Bondo, Vice Chair.
Thank you. Okay, I have a couple of questions both for language development. Thank you, Gomez, for the presentation. So when I see the ratio of the teacher on the language development from the pre-K, elementary school, and secondary, like the 1 to 18, 126, and 129, those are the new students. Those are the average of the new student, or those are the students coming from grade to grade. I mean, from one grade to another grade.
So, for example, the elementary are basically kindergarten through 5th grade students currently. So that would be one teacher to 26 elementary students. At the secondary, it's 9th through 12th grade, and pre-K is just pre-K.
All right. So those students are going to a different classroom, or they have a support in the mainstream class?
Yeah, I can start. I want to make a quick comment on that, Carlos. Obviously, you can add on to that. But yeah, I want to be clear, and I don't know if this was connected to your question as well, Chair Lentz, but this is in addition to the teacher that they have in their classroom. Okay. So one thing that's super important in terms of our philosophy is that who's ever in your class is your student. So you will have a student with IEP. You will have a student who's a multilingual learner. The classroom teacher is their teacher. And then these additional teachers and ed techs we're talking to are above and beyond for additional support, which sometimes will be directly working with students, and sometimes it's in the form of their collaboration with the classroom teacher. But a concern or a risk with when we talk about this way is that we start to think, oh, if you're a multilingual student, then this is your teacher. That's not true. Your teacher is your teacher. And then we pad on all this additional support for the unique needs that the students have. Yeah. So I just wanted to clarify that.
That's a good clarification. Thank you. That makes really sense. That's exactly what I was looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my answer. That's a good answer to me. So my second one is that, and I just recording every year, I try to follow the data. I don't know if we're going to have that one providing in our process here for the dual identify students. How many we have right now? If I can have it. And also, and I remember following the language development, we have some students who've been there for 5 or more years. So I just need to understand what we do with those students and what kind of strategy do we have for those students by knowing that our exceed proficiency went down to 4, right? If I get correct, from 6 to 4, right? Where they can be exceed
4.5 is
4.5. Yes. Yeah.
So.
And then how many students been already exceeded from the ESOL? Yeah. From last year.
So I think one of your questions was how many multilingual learners have IEPs? I believe we were about 273 or so the last time I looked, but I can confirm that number.
So I mean, sorry. So it's been increasing every year, right? Because 2 years we were, if I got my math correctly, it was close to 240 or 250. So if we got 270, so that one been increased because of the newcomers, or what's the issue there?
It could be because of the newcomers. It could be through the referral process. There could be a number of factors of why there are. Overall, we have had an increase in the total number of multilingual students. So as a percentage, we're probably still within the same. But we can confirm that for you.
Yes, because I remember we made some investment a couple of years ago, especially in that specific area when we vote for the law plan. So I just want to make sure that, we are aligning what we're doing as implementation here and what's the result and impact then we see here happening to that specific area, because it was a really huge investment that we have made. So I just want to have a follow-up later on to have those factors to make sure that, I can stay on track for that. Okay. So my last question is...
Member Bondo, can I just say, sorry to interrupt you, but just one thing, because I know you're about to move to a second question. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine, please.
And I agree, Carlos. We can pull together just a brief summary. So Vice Chair Bondo remembers this trajectory of work, of course, but for those who are newer, we did add a 1.0 position to support students duly identified. This position was to coordinate processes, systems, screening, assessment, and that position does remain. We had proposed an additional FTE, and that was for serving students in specialized programs. So like you saw in the special ed ratio, we take, the dual identification into consideration. So there are kids that are in resource that are multilingual that are getting supported by ESOL teachers, but we did identify that students who are in, let's say, Beach or Bridge that are multilingual learners as well, that there would be, that there was a proposal from the team to add a teacher who specializes in that, and that has not gotten added to the budget. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there's been a request for that, and that we have not provided that yet in terms of the direct service position. Right. So anyway, go ahead. We'll follow up with some of those other specifics, but I just wanted to mention that too.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, does make sense. Thank you so much. So how many social workers do we have right now currently, and how many are multilingual?
We have all total, I believe the number is 38, 39 if you count our Assistant Director of Clinical and Behavioral Supports, Erica Boer. How many are multilingual? It is just a handful. I would say.
Handful, like a 5, 3, 5,
Like-
7?
Like less than 5.
Wow. All right.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to mention that's been a big goal for us. And so, and Vice Chair Bondo, you, I think, know Blanca Santiago, but just again, to build other people's context. So Blanca was previously a multilingual social worker within the district and then has left the district, but we continue to have a contract with her that's specifically intended to do work with aspiring social workers or people that are earlier in their careers who are multilingual. So that's a strategy that we invest in to try to proactively build a pipeline of multilingual social workers. But with that being said, and she's been successful at helping bring forward candidates, but as Chris mentioned, it's a very small percent of our total social work population at this point, and it's definitely something we see as a key need.
Exactly. Thank you. So I heard Mr. Gomez mention about 17. We got 17 students adding from the new arrival. So I'm just trying to look at the picture of the student we just received, the new arrival. Most of them are homeless. I mean, they just maybe living in the shelter or hotels. So maybe a follow-up question, a follow-up facts, and I want to see also is that how many then we had from the previous year, 2022, and coming to 2023, are really stay, because as soon they find a housing can be going to different districts. And I know the housing issue is just going to getting crazy now. So we're moving a lot of families to Saco. We're moving a lot of family to Freeport. So I'm just wondering right now, because if we look at to our next budget and we think about, okay, we have a new student, new arrival. I just want to see what's the percentage of those students that we need. Then we say, okay, we can make investment for that. We don't have to make the investment right now because they are moving out of our district. So can we have those follow-up facts?
Next week, Grace is going to talk about the recent influx of multilingual learners that are coming. So I think you'll get some context there. And then we do intend to provide us some of the background documentation. I think, Aaron, we talked about this through Finance Committee, these spreadsheets. So you have transparency. And so they would show you time-stamped the total number of students that we have right now, which would, of course, reflect who's just recently arrived and who's left. And that's going to be the number that we anchor against with the planning, because that's what we have at this moment. But we're super cognizant of how much this changes. But that is something we're planning to provide for you all to have full transparency into.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Those are my questions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Member Russell-Better?
Thank you. I just had a couple questions, comments. I think this was back in the special ed piece of the presentation, but I was just curious if you could just touch on the BCBA positions, the Board Certified Behavior Analyst, and are those only in the behavior programs themselves, right, and not in the general population? Is that right?
Yeah, I'll answer the second part first, then kick it to you, Julie. Correct. So right now our BCBAs are only servicing special education. You may recall that when we proposed the behavioral and mental health investments in ESSERF, part of that was to add 2 BCBAs, an elementary and a secondary one, who could consult with general education as well. When we developed that job description in the summer, we actually kind of expanded it. So it wasn't just a BCBA. We thought somebody with some classroom behavior management experience as well would be useful. So we broadened the profile. We were not able to successfully fill either of those positions. So that's, we talked a little bit about some of that ESSERF money before in terms of there's been moves to reallocate for the same global purpose, but we do, just to be clear, not have those other 2 BCBAs working within general education. And then Julie, maybe you can just speak to what we have right now and which programs they service, and maybe just for people who don't know, a very brief definition of a BCBA.
Yeah, sure. So BCBA is a board certified behavioral analysis, and they work with teams. And so they don't work individually with students. Generally, it's working through a consultation model with the team, working with the student, with the ed techs or special education teachers on the function of the behavior that the student is having, or their behavior, and then what is the function of the behavior in order to then modify that behavior, decrease behaviors, increase social communication, things of that nature. And so we have two FDEs for our BCBAs. One is for all of our beach programs. So the two classrooms, the elementary school level, the one at middle and one at high school level. She will also consult with teams that where they think a student may be appropriate for the beach program, but they're not in there. So she does a lot of observations throughout the district to support teams before a student comes to the beach program, or to work with the team so a student can stay in their least restrictive environment of their neighborhood school. And then our other BCBA has joint responsibilities in the functional life skills program K-12 and our behavior program K-12.
Okay, thank you. And then my understanding is those, functional behavioral analysis, right? Or assessment, sorry, that's really best practice, right? But that's a very specific skill set that those folks have, right? So I guess I would just advocate, and so Superintendent Nally, are those two positions that didn't get filled, is the goal still to get folks that do have the BCBA?
When we're going to get into the process, right? We've been talking about this context that we're faced with, which means that, we're opening up ESSERF to reevaluate each of the existing investments and considering that part of our larger kind of pie, resource to use, excuse me. And so that'll be part of this process for what we bring forward. I think right now unfilled positions are not necessarily things that are advancing when we're in a context of cutting, not a small amount of things. But yeah, so that we'll talk about that when we get to those recommendations.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question was about the social work positions, which Dr. Reiger was helpful to just remember the ratio piece. So I would guess that my assumption would be, I believe we talked about this in the past about the halftime FTEs or whatever. So I was thinking many of our elementary schools probably have one, right? But then because I can't think of any that have two. So it is kind of like a halftime position if, say, if the student population is like 400, do those schools have like the 1.5?
Yeah, and some of our elementary schools have more than one social worker as well.
Yeah.
And once again, we'll share that spreadsheet. And so you'll be able to see number of students and number of, social workers, counselors, et cetera, for each of our schools.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess and Dr. Reiger's mentioning about that intensive needs part, which I think you said, Dr. Reiger, that's not very clearly explain what that means. But I would say, and I think you mentioned that the 1 to 50 would be more in those programs, right? That we have social work staff, that's much more. But I guess I would just argue, and then, I know we're going to continue talking about this with budget discussions, but I would just argue in seeing, the number of McKinney-Vento students, the number of newcomers that, our social workers are really helping with that Maslow hierarchy of needs. Like I'm seeing, students getting their, clothing needs and wonderful that our buildings have showers and laundry, those basic needs. And they're not really able to do a lot of the work that's, I see, in our building that, those staff aren't able to do the groups that they were doing and the individual student work. So I would say that I would call as being intensive needs, right? Because we're talking about students coming and getting support for their basic needs to be met, which has to be number one, right? But then those social workers' jobs to really meet some of the social, emotional, family needs, I think are not being met when when we have one person to fill those needs. So I guess I just am highlighting that as I think a good conversation for us to be having when we're talking about budget priorities. So thank you.
I appreciate you highlighting that. And I would agree that, there are intensive needs in every classroom. And so while we're doing our best to, as Malia, outlined, follow protocols and procedures and show our work, the numbers don't fully communicate the needs in every classroom. And so the idea of, 250 to 1, 250 students for a counselor, 250 students for a social worker with all that they hold, I would love it if it was 50 to 1 or less. And so just thank you for raising that.
Yeah. Thank you.
Oops, I'm muted. Chair Lentz?
Yeah, just in a similar vein, I guess I'm wondering if the ratios and sizes in this presentation are like ideal. Like some of them, it sounded like we're under kind of like the standard recommendation, but I was just curious, especially in ESOL and other places, like, is there an ideal that feels, obviously I know that this is not a budget year in which we're going to be able to add a lot to anywhere, if at all, but I just am curious, like, I think it's helpful to say out loud, like, what would be ideal if we could have that?
I mean, I think that unless somebody has a specific target in mind, I don't know, Carlos, for you or others, I think, we've tried to do the work we've done, like I mentioned, using the inputs, like in the case of language, the LAU plan, the different kinds of research Carlos talked about, to come out with what we're proposing as the appropriate ratio. I mean, if you're asking people in education what's ideal, I feel like we're always going to say more. So let me just be clear. We would love more. I think on the language development side, I think a future evolution that might be more ideal is to actually factor in some of those weighted considerations that Carlos was talking through. So we do that for special ed, but in the ratios he mentioned, the differences are really at the IELD and the CALS level as it pertains to how the ratio gets built. And then we look at things like McKinney-Vento, et cetera, for judgment calls when things are on the line, but they're not formally baked into the methodology. So I think that's something we've talked about and questioned, and certainly our administrators have asked about that as well. So I would say that. And then I think, with the behavioral health, because of the fuzziness of that 50 to 1, I think we do great with our, assuming we're fully staffed, let me be very clear, with our programs like Breathe for what we have planned, but getting somewhere more in between the 250 and 50, given the needs of our students and community, I think would be our preference. So that would be how and then I think with special ed, I think, like I said, we've already lowered it to what we think is more optimal. So I would have to kind of work with the team to look at, is there some other methodology that would get us even lower than that as well? Aaron, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I think, to this question and related to kind of the class size, I just want to, introduce that I think we are trying to target what we do think. I don't know if ideal is the word I would use, but I think the appropriate kind of investment in terms of ratios. And I guess I would posit that I don't know that more or less is necessarily the pathway towards improved outcomes and experiences for the students. Right. That there's a role of the quality of the experience that happens there, our ability to support those educators doing that work. And that requires a significant level of coordination and support. And so just investing purely in more at that direct service level, I don't think, and I think, doesn't necessarily equate to improved outcomes. I think there's certainly a threshold upon which, and that, is problematic, would be problematic, right? And so, but, the work that's happened across these domains, right, from general ed classroom levels to special ed ESOL and the behavioral health are intended to be like, this is an appropriate allocation of resource, right, to be able to kind of get the outcomes. And our focus, unfortunately, with the support of, the board, the community at large, we've been able to staff up in many ways over the past number of years in terms of the Portland Promise investments. And right, I think we suffer from filling the positions. We have resourced them. So filling the positions is a significant challenge. And then providing the right kind of supports for those educators to be effective and to retain them, I would argue is as critical of an investment as continuing to just simply, kind of decrease ratios.
Member Opperman.
I would just add, among the multilingual learners, if we said hypothetically we have 2,000 students and 1,000 of them are beginning level English and 1,000 of them are advanced academic language, cognitive academic language skill level, that's going to require a different resource than if it's 1,500 ILD students and 500 Cal students. So the ratios would be different there. Then the needs would be different, and that would need to be factored in as well. And that is a moving target that changes every month at the district level across multiple schools, and that affects some schools more than others. So there's like three gravitational forces that factor in here. And again, doesn't tell the ratios don't tell the full story, but they tell a clearer story than what we've seen before.
Thanks, Carlos. Member Opperman?
So many questions. I'm looking forward to seeing the spreadsheet, as many details, because that's how my brain works. But one of the things I'm looking at all these pieces and where to ask questions is my concern about inclusion, whether it's special ed or ELL, and the ability for the teacher, the classroom teacher, to collaborate with all the special ESOLs, ELLs, social workers, and all to maximize the individuals in their regular ed type classroom. And so it's when you're talking, as Superintendent Townsend said, when you're talking about ratios, it's, where the ratios depending upon what's in a particular classroom and what ability is there for the collaboration to occur. So I think, aside from just numbers here, the idea of, and this is in your venue, not mine, to figure out ways to maximize that collaboration, to maximize the use, the specialties as they translate into the classroom. So and as I said, I went through have questions on every single piece of it, and I'm impressed by all of the work Julie and Carlos and Chris have done on this, because it's a lot of work and it's mind-boggling. So,
yeah, I appreciate that. And I just want to make one comment. I appreciate you bringing up that point, or putting a fine point on the collaboration, Member Opperman. That's right on. And I think that's where we've been most challenged at the elementary level, to find the time for that collaboration to happen. So, part of this picture, as Erin was describing, in terms of the coordination support, is the way we structure our time. And so that's come up as a complexity, is, how you fit the pieces together, so that the educators have the time, whether it's the teachers collaborating or also working with ed techs in the classroom, to set them up to be successful and aligned with whatever is happening in the instruction. So very much on our mind. We've been working on that collaboration framework and trying to, like last year with elementary schools, we had a big push to look at schedules so that we could prioritize doing this more successfully. But I would say that's still a work in progress across all grade spans, but especially at elementary, given that they have the least amount of shared collaboration time.
So, as a follow-up to what you said, as I look at the budget, for me, that would be understanding where the pieces fit to make that happen. And I think it'd be financially efficient, but it may take some real creativity and effort to do that outside of this. So good luck.
Thank you. Great. Chair Lentz, I'll pass it back to you, and folks can certainly follow up with you and us if they have things that linger as follow-up questions. Happy to follow up.
Thank you so much to everybody that was here tonight, and the depth to which you were able to really talk about what is happening. I see board members across the screen kind of like having information now to be settled and kind of like things that they've been thinking about. So that is really great and gives me a light of, I don't know if excitement is the right word as we move through budget season, but just kind of alignment amongst ourselves. So that concludes all of our programming for tonight, but we'll see you next week on March 7th. But there's also the budget forum is on Monday night. So please take note of that. Is it 6 to 7, I believe? And it's Casco Bay. It can be in person or online. That information is on social media and on the website. It's a really great place for folks to get more questions answered. So thank you all very much and have a good night.